Good evening, dear listener, or perhaps good morning, whichever finds you curled up with a cup of tea and a comfortable chair. You are cordially invited back to the sleepy English village of St. Mary Mead, where nothing is ever quite as peaceful as it seems. Pull the blanket a little closer, for tonight we join that gentlest yet sharpest of detectives, Miss Jane Marple, in a tale of secrets, buttercups, and a milkmaid who knew far more than she ever let on. Chapter 1. The Broken Churn. The village of St. Mary Mead lay drowsing in the pale gold of a late summer morning, the sort of morning that makes even the most restless soul feel that nothing very much need happen before luncheon. Sunlight slanted across the village green, picking out the dew on the grass and turning the weathered spire of St. Mary's Church into a spear of quiet flame. Hollyhocks leaned over cottage gates in lazy profusion, and from somewhere beyond the lich gate came the faint, contented lowing of cows waiting to be milked. It was Thursday, the 10th of September, 1953, and St. Mary Mead was preparing, without undue haste, for its annual dairy festival. Bunting already fluttered half-heartedly from the post office and the Blue Boar, and in cottage windows one might glimpse the gleam of polished brass milk churns waiting to be decorated with paper roses and ribbons. The festival was the high point of the village year. There would be a Dairy Queen crowned on Saturday afternoon, a display of prize jerseys, and an abundance of scones with strawberry jam and clotted cream that would keep the Women's Institute talking for months. At Gossington Farm, half a mile along the lane past the church, old Mr. Elias Bannings rose early as always. He was a widower of 72, tall still, though stooping a little now, with a weathered face and a temper that had grown shorter with the years. He had farmed the same 120 acres for nearly half a century, and he knew every mood of his Jersey herd as well as he had once known his late wife's. At 4:30, he was already in the milking parlour, checking that the churns were clean, the pails in place, and the pitchfork, used for shifting straw, leaning in its accustomed corner. By 6 o'clock the sun was fully up, and young Rosie Trotter, the milkmaid, should have arrived to begin the milking. Rosie was a quiet, pretty girl of 22 with soft brown hair, always neatly confined beneath a starched cap, and an apron that was the envy of the village for its whiteness. She had worked for Mr. Bannings since she was 14, first as a help to her mother who cleaned the farmhouse, and later as full milkmaid. She was punctual to the minute, and Mr. Bannings valued punctuality almost as highly as he valued a good yield of cream. But on this particular morning Rosie did not appear. At 6:15, Tommy Pierce, Mr. Bannings' great-nephew and only living relative, cycled up the lane on his way to open the garage in the High Street. Tommy was 19, lanky and apt to sulk when crossed. He had quarreled with his great-uncle only the evening before, loudly enough for half the village to hear, over money Tommy claimed was owed him for work done on the farm. Seeing no sign of life at the milking parlour, he propped his bicycle against the gate and went to look. He found the side door ajar. Inside, the parlour was dim and cool, smelling of sweet hay and warm milk yet to be drawn. The 6 jerseys lowed plaintively from their stalls, shifting restlessly, their udders full. And there, slumped against the wall between 2 empty pails, was Mr. Elias Bannings. A pitchfork protruded from his chest. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. There was blood, though not as much as one might expect, darkening the front of his old tweed waistcoat. The handle of the pitchfork was clean of fingerprints, wiped carefully with a rag that now lay neatly folded on a nearby stool. Tommy stood frozen for a full 10 seconds before the horror of it struck him. Then he shouted, once, hoarsely, and ran out into the yard. Constable Paulk, cycling placidly towards the village on his morning round, heard the shouts and arrived breathless within minutes. He was a kindly young man with round cheeks and an unshakable belief that nothing truly dreadful ever happened in St. Mary Mead. After one look at the body, he turned rather green, but he managed to keep his head. "Accident," he said firmly, more to reassure himself than anyone else. Poor old gentleman must have slipped and fallen on his own fork. Tragic, but these things happen on farms. Tommy, still white and shaking, said nothing. He was staring at something else, the place where the largest churn, the decorated festival churn, tall and gleaming, usually stood. It was missing. By 8 o'clock, the news had spread like gorse fire. Mrs. Price Ridley told Miss Weatherby over the fence. Miss Weatherby telephoned Miss Hartnell, and Miss Hartnell hurried to the vicarage to inform the vicar's wife, who immediately rang Mrs. Bantry at Gossington Hall. Within the hour, the entire village knew that Elias Bannings was dead, and opinions were divided between those who thought it a terrible accident and those who suspected something far more sinister. Miss Jane Marple, taking her usual morning walk with a light ash plant walking stick and a sensible dove-gray glove on one hand, paused at the farm gate just as Constable Polk emerged, looking harassed. Dr. Haydock's car was drawn up in the yard, and the doctor himself could be seen through the open door of the parlor, bending over the body. Miss Marple did not intrude. She simply stood quietly, observing. She noted first that the churn was indeed missing. Second, that the cows had not been milked, an omission quite out of character for either Mr. Bannings or Rosie Trotter. Third, that a milkmaid's apron, starched white with a narrow border of broderie anglaise, lay discarded among the nettles by the gate, one corner stained dark red. And fourth, that Constable Polk was already closing the gate with an air of finality, as though the matter were settled. "Dear me," said Miss Marple softly to herself, resting her gloved hand on the warm wood of the gate. "How very curious." A breeze stirred the leaves of the horse-chestnut tree overhead, and somewhere a thrush began to sing. The village went peacefully about its morning business. The butcher's boy cycled past whistling. Mrs. Dane Calthrop came out of the vicarage with a basket of flowers for the altar, and old Miss Blacklock waved from her gate with a trowel in one earthy hand. Yet beneath the familiar surface, something had shifted. Miss Marple felt it as clearly as one feels the first chill that warns of approaching winter. "Accidents," she murmured, turning at last towards home, "are so very rarely accidental." And in the quiet of her mind she began gently but inexorably to arrange the first small pieces of a pattern that was only just beginning to take shape. Chapter 2. The Five Who Stood to Gain. By 11 o'clock the sun had climbed high enough to make the village green shimmer gently, and the news of Mr. Bannings's death had settled over St. Mary Mead like a fine dust, impossible to ignore, yet no one quite knew what to do with it. At Gossington Hall, Mrs. Bantry, large, good-natured, and always ready to believe the worst of human nature in the most charitable way, had declared an informal council of war. Tea was laid in the morning room. Thin bread and butter, 2 kinds of cake, and a plate of Mrs. Hickson's celebrated cheese scones. Miss Marple had been summoned by telephone. "Do come, Jane, you're so good at this sort of thing." And she arrived promptly in a neat dove-gray coat and a hat with a modest violet trimming. Mrs. Bantry wasted no time. "Well, Jane," she said, pouring tea with a generous hand. "Accident or murder? Constable Polk says accident, but I've never heard of anyone falling on a pitchfork quite so neatly. And the churn missing. It's all very odd." Miss Marple accepted her cup and stirred it thoughtfully. "Very odd indeed, Dolly, and poor Rosie Trotter nowhere to be found. One does wonder." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward conspiratorially. "Now the people who stood to gain, there are 5, I think. First, young Tommy Pierce. He'll inherit the farm, or so everyone says. They quarreled dreadfully yesterday evening. Half the village heard it. Tommy shouting that his great-uncle was a miser and had promised him money for a motorbike or some such nonsense." Miss Marple nodded. Young men are often impatient, and Tommy has always struck me as rather sulky. But sulkiness is not the same as violence. Second, continued Mrs. Bantry, warming to her theme, Mrs. Lavinia Croft, the housekeeper. She's been with Mr. Bannings for 30 years. 30 years, Jane. She always believed he'd leave her the farm, or at least a life interest. But lately there's been talk of a new will. She was heard muttering only last week that some people didn't know when they were well off. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Mrs. Croft is a proud woman. Pride can curdle, you know. Third, now this is gossip, but you know how these things get about. Clarissa Vale, Dr. Haydock's new nurse, very pretty, all golden curls and red lips. There was talk that Mr. Bannings was quite épris, walking out with her, taking her to the pictures in much Benham, giving her little presents. Then suddenly it stopped. She was seen leaving the farm in a temper last month. Imagine! A man of 72. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Human nature is very inconsistent, Dolly, particularly where affections are concerned. Fourth, Mr. Reginald Archer, the land agent from much Benham, smooth as butter, always in a camel hair coat. He's been trying to buy Gossington Farm for some building syndicate. Offered a very good price, I believe, but Mr. Bannings wouldn't hear of it. Over my dead body, he said apparently. Well, Mrs. Bantry spread her hands expressively. Words can be prophetic, murmured Miss Marple, though seldom intentionally. And fifth, poor Rosie herself, the milkmaid. She's vanished completely. Her mother is in a terrible state. Rosie was devoted to the cows, Mrs. Trotter says, and would never leave them unmilked. Yet there they were, poor creatures, bawling their hearts out. Miss Marple set her cup down with care. Rosie is a good girl, quiet, hard-working. But good girls can have secrets just as much as anyone else. Mrs. Bantry refilled their cups. The police will have to be called properly, of course. Paulk is a dear boy, but he wouldn't recognize a murder if it danced in front of him wearing a red nose. I've telephoned my old friend Sir Henry Clithering. He'll speak to Scotland Yard. They'll send someone down. Miss Marple looked towards the window where the leaves of the copper beech stirred lazily in the breeze. 5 people, she said softly, each with something to gain or something to lose, and a missing churn. One does wonder what exactly was carried away in it. Mrs. Bantry stared. You don't think, surely not the body? Miss Marple smiled gently. No, no, Dolly. The body was found after all. But something was moved or hidden, and that blood-stained apron in the nettles. Rosie's apron, I'm quite sure. Why would she discard it? And where has she gone? At that moment the door opened and Colonel Bantry came in, red-faced from the garden. Well, ladies, any solutions yet? The whole village is buzzing. Old Miss Blacklock says it's suicide. Mr. Bannings impaled himself out of remorse for some dark deed in his past. Miss Hartnell thinks communists. And Price Ridley swears she saw a strange man lurking near the farm yesterday evening. Mrs. Bantry snorted. Price Ridley sees strange men every time the wind changes. Miss Marple rose to leave. I must call on Mrs. Trotter, she said. Poor woman will be distraught, and perhaps I shall just pass by the farm again. One sometimes notices things the second time that one misses the first. As she walked down the lane towards the village, Miss Marple's mind was busy. She passed the post office where Mrs. Finch was serving a queue of customers, all discussing the tragedy in lowered voices. She nodded to the vicar's wife, who was arranging flowers by the lich gate, and she paused for a moment outside the Blue Boar where Tommy Pierce stood moodily smoking a cigarette, his bicycle propped against the wall. He looked up as she approached, his young face sullen and frightened. Morning, Miss Marple. Good morning, Tommy. Such a terrible shock for you. He shrugged, looking away. Great uncle was always clumsy. Tripping over things serves him right in a way. Miss Marple regarded him mildly. Grief takes people differently, Tommy. Some weep, some grow angry. Some say things they don't entirely mean. He flushed and ground out his cigarette. I've got to get to the garage, work to do. He mounted his bicycle and rode off without another word. Miss Marple continued on her way, her thoughts turning like the quiet click of knitting needles. 5 people, she reflected. 5 threads in a pattern that was only just beginning to emerge. And somewhere among them the truth lay hidden, like a single yellow buttercup pressed between the pages of a book no one had thought to open. Chapter 3. A Question of Buttercups. The afternoon sun had softened into a mellow glow by the time Miss Marple turned her steps towards the cluster of small cottages behind the butcher's shop. The air was filled with the faint sweet scent of late roses and the distant hum of bees among the Michaelmas daisies. St. Mary Mead, for all the shadow that had fallen across it, retained its accustomed tranquility. Only the occasional knot of villagers whispering at a gate betrayed that anything was amiss. Mrs. Trotter's cottage was the last in the row, its front garden a riot of old-fashioned flowers. Snapdragons, sweet williams, and a bold clump of yellow buttercups that nodded cheerfully against the whitewashed wall. Miss Marple paused for a moment at the gate, noting the buttercups with mild interest before lifting the latch. The door opened almost at once. Mrs. Trotter stood there, apron twisted between her work-worn hands, her eyes red-rimmed. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her voice cracking. "Do come in. I'm that beside myself. I don't know whether I'm coming or going." Miss Marple stepped inside. The little parlor was spotlessly clean, smelling faintly of lavender polish and fresh-baked bread. On the mantelpiece, above a neatly laid but untouched fire, stood a photograph in a plain wooden frame. Rosie Trotter at last year's dairy festival, smiling shyly in her milkmaid's costume. Starched white cap, spotless apron with its border of broderie anglaise, and around her neck a garland of bright yellow buttercups. "Such a pretty picture," said Miss Marple gently, settling herself in the offered chair. "Rosie looks very happy." Mrs. Trotter sank into the opposite chair and dabbed at her eyes with the corner of her apron. "She was happy then, miss. That was the proudest day of her life, being chosen to hand the prize cup to the Dairy Queen. She'd worked so hard on her costume, picked the buttercups herself from the water meadow. Said they were the prettiest flowers in the world." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the photograph. "Buttercups are indeed very bright," she observed. "Though I always think they bruise so easily, don't you? The least pressure, and the petals are marked forever." Mrs. Trotter looked puzzled for a moment, then shook her head. "I don't know about bruising, miss. Rosie loved them, said they reminded her of sunshine. But now, oh, Miss Marple, where can she be? She never came home last night. She left here at 4:30 yesterday afternoon, same as always, to do the evening milking. Said she'd be back by 8 for her supper. When she didn't come, I thought perhaps Mr. Bannings had kept her late. Sometimes he did, if there was extra work. But this morning, when I heard what had happened," her voice broke completely. Miss Marple leaned forward and patted the distraught woman's hand. Now, my dear, we mustn't give way. Rosie is a sensible girl. She may simply have gone to stay with a friend, someone she felt safe with after the shock. But why wouldn't she send word, and that poor man dead? They're saying it was an accident, but Rosie would never leave the cows unmilked, not ever. She loved those jerseys like they were her own children. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Love for animals is a very strong tie, and yet fear can be stronger still. If Rosie arrived at the parlor and found Mr. Bannings already hurt, she might have been too frightened to think clearly. Mrs. Trotter clutched her apron tighter. You don't think she— Oh, miss, she couldn't have. Rosie wouldn't hurt a fly. No, said Miss Marple quietly. I don't think she did. But she may know something that frightened her very much. Has she seemed worried lately? Any strangers about the farm? Any quarrels? Mrs. Trotter hesitated. Well, there was that business with young Tommy Pierce shouting at his great-uncle the other evening. Rosie heard it all, she told me when she came home. Said it fair turned her stomach, the things Tommy called the old man. And then there's Mrs. Croft. She's been sharp with Rosie these past weeks ever since the talk of the new will, but nothing that would make Rosie run off, nothing like that. Miss Marple's eyes returned to the photograph. And Mr. Bannings himself? Was he kind to Rosie? Mrs. Trotter gave a short, bitter laugh. Kind? He was the same to her as he was to everyone. Gruff and close-fisted. Paid her fair, mind you, and never docked her wages when she was ill. But he had his funny ways. Lately he'd taken to locking the desk in the farmhouse office. Rosie said she saw him do it twice when she was cleaning, and once or twice she found him reading letters that seemed to upset him. He'd stuff them in his pocket quick-like when she came in. Letters, repeated Miss Marple softly. How interesting. She rose to leave, pausing once more before the mantelpiece. These buttercups in Rosie's garland, they're very fresh in the photograph. Did she press any flowers herself, do you know? Some girls like to keep souvenirs. Mrs. Trotter shook her head. Not Rosie. She said pressed flowers went sad and brown. She liked them best growing wild in the meadow. Miss Marple thanked her kindly and took her leave. As she walked back down the lane, her mind was busy with small, seemingly disconnected details. The blood-stained apron in the nettles, the missing churn, the unmilked cows, and now, buttercups that bruised easily. She had just reached the crossroads when she encountered Dr. Haydock's neat little Austin pulling up outside the vicarage. The doctor, a spare, gray-haired man with shrewd eyes, got out and greeted her. Well, Miss Marple, I suppose you've heard our excitement? I have indeed, Doctor. A most distressing business. Haydock glanced around to ensure they were alone, then lowered his voice. Between ourselves, it's no accident. The angle of the wound, impossible for a fall, and the pitchfork wiped clean. Someone meant business. But don't quote me, not until the yard's man arrives. Miss Marple nodded serenely. I shan't breathe a word, though I fancy the village has already made up its mind on several points. Haydock snorted. Village gossip, half of it moonshine, though I will say this. Elias Bannings made enemies easily enough. Tight as a drum and proud of it, still. He shook his head. Poor devil. As the doctor went on his way, Miss Marple continued towards home, her thoughts circling gently but persistently around one small, bright image. A garland of buttercups, golden and perfect, around the neck of a smiling milkmaid who had now vanished into the soft September dusk. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, she felt quite certain. There was someone who knew exactly where Rosie had gone. And why. Chapter 4. The matter of the missing churn. The following morning brought a light drizzle that veiled St. Mary Mead in soft gray, the sort of weather that kept sensible people indoors with a good fire and discouraged unnecessary gossip, at least until the post office opened. Miss Marple, however, was not to be deterred by a little rain. Wrapped in a serviceable mackintosh and a felt hat secured with a sensible pin, she set out soon after breakfast for Gossington Farm. The farmyard was unusually busy. Constable Paulk stood at the gate looking important, while two young constables from Much Benham tramped about measuring distances with a tape. Dr. Haydock's car was still there, and a black police saloon had drawn up beside the milking parlor. Word had evidently reached Scotland Yard faster than expected, for a tall, dark-haired man in a well-cut town overcoat was conferring with the doctor just inside the doorway. Miss Marple paused at the gate, observing quietly. The missing churn had been discovered, she learned from a snippet of conversation that drifted across the yard. It had been found submerged in the duck pond at the bottom of the lower meadow, weighed down with bricks. "Scrubbed clean as a whistle," one of the young constables announced to his colleague. "Not a mark on it. Funny business, that." The tall stranger turned and caught sight of Miss Marple. He came across the yard with an easy stride. "Miss Marple, I believe," he said pleasantly. "Mrs. Bantry has spoken of you. Inspector Dermot Craddock, Scotland Yard. I understand you were one of the first on the scene yesterday." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I merely paused at the gate, Inspector. One does not like to intrude at such a time. But I could not help noticing certain irregularities." Craddock's eyes sharpened with interest. "I'd be glad of your observations, ma'am. Perhaps you'd step inside out of the rain." The milking parlor smelled faintly of disinfectant now, overlaying the usual sweet scents of hay and milk. The body had been removed, but chalk marks on the floor showed where it had lain. The pitchfork stood propped in a corner wrapped in brown paper. Craddock led her to the place where the festival churn had stood. "This is the object that puzzled everyone," he said. "Large brass-bound churn used only for display. Found in the pond this morning, clean inside and out. No blood, no fingerprints, nothing. Constable Polk thinks the poor fellow may have been moving it himself and had some sort of mishap." Miss Marple regarded the empty space thoughtfully. "And yet the churn was not in its usual place when the body was discovered. Curious. Might I see it, Inspector?" Craddock hesitated, then nodded to one of the constables, who went off and returned wheeling the churn on a small trolley. It gleamed wetly in the dim light, water still trickling from its seams. "Handled carefully," Craddock said. "No prints on the outside. Lid screws on tightly. See?" He unscrewed the heavy lid and tipped the churn slightly so that Miss Marple could peer inside. It was spotlessly clean, the metal polished bright. And there, pressed flat against the inner surface of the lid as though someone had closed it upon the flower deliberately, lay a single yellow buttercup. The stalk was snapped cleanly in two, the petals bruised and darkened at the edges. Miss Marple straightened slowly. "How very interesting," she murmured. Craddock looked at her sharply. "You see something significant in a buttercup, Miss Marple?" "One sees what one sees, Inspector. Buttercups are common enough in the meadows hereabouts, but not, I think, inside milk churns. And this one has been pressed, quite deliberately, I should say." Craddock examined the flower more closely. "Pressed by the closing of the lid, perhaps. Might have blown in through the door." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple politely. "Though there is very little wind in a milking parlor, and buttercups do not generally blow about in September." She turned her attention to the rest of the room. The pails were neatly aligned, the milking stools in their places. The folded rag that had been used to wipe the pitchfork lay on a shelf, initialed neatly in one corner. E.B. "Mr. Bannings was methodical," Miss Marple observed. "Very," agreed Craddock. "Everything in its place, which makes the missing churn and the discarded apron all the odder." They stepped outside again. The rain had eased to a fine mist. Miss Marple's gaze traveled across the yard to the nettles where she had seen the blood-stained apron. It had been removed now, bagged as evidence. "That apron belonged to Rosie Trotter," she said. "I recognized the broderie anglaise. Her mother worked the border herself. There was blood on one corner, but not a great deal. Certainly not enough for a serious injury." Craddock made a note in his little black book. "We're searching for the girl. She can't have gone far. Uniform or checking the buses and the railway station at Much Benham. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. A sensible precaution. Though I fancy Rosie is still close by. She would not leave her mother without a word unless she felt herself in great danger, or believed someone else to be. Craddock looked at her thoughtfully. You don't think this was an accident, then? Miss Marple considered the question with her usual mild deliberation. People do not, as a rule, impale themselves on pitchforks and then carefully wipe the handle clean, Inspector. Nor do they move large churns to duck ponds and scrub them thoroughly before dying. No, I fear this was murder, cleverly contrived murder. Craddock closed his notebook with a snap. Then we'd best find Rosie Trotter quickly. She may be the only person who can tell us what really happened here. As Miss Marple took her leave and walked slowly back down the lane, her umbrella tilted against the drizzle. Her mind was occupied with the image of that single bruised buttercup. It meant something, she was sure of it. In her long experience, nothing was ever quite accidental, not even the placing of a flower in an unexpected place. She passed the post office where a small knot of villagers had gathered under the awning to discuss the latest developments. Mrs. Price Ridley was holding forth in her penetrating voice. Mark my words, it's that young Tommy Pierce. Everyone knows he quarreled with his great-uncle. Blood will out, you know. Miss Hartnell, stout and sensible, shook her head. Nonsense. Tommy hasn't the gumption for murder. Now, if it were that Mrs. Croft... Miss Marple passed on without comment, but her lips curved in a faint smile. Village opinion was a wonderful thing, but it so often mistook the shadow for the substance. By the time she reached her own gate, the rain had stopped and a watery sun was struggling through the clouds. Miss Marple paused to deadhead a few late roses, her thoughts turning gently but persistently on the problem of the churn, the buttercup, and the missing milkmaid. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, she reflected, someone had gone to a great deal of trouble to make a murder look like an accident. And someone else, perhaps Rosie, knew why. It was all, Miss Marple thought as she went indoors to change into dry shoes, very interesting indeed. Chapter 5. Alibis and Apple Charlotte. The vicarage drawing room was a haven of gentle chaos that afternoon. Faded chintz covers on the armchairs, a faint scent of beeswax and dried lavender, and a large table laid for what the vicar's wife optimistically called a simple tea. In truth, it was a full-scale gathering of the Dairy Festival Committee, hastily convened under the pretext of discussing Saturday's arrangements now that poor Mr. Bannings could no longer preside. Everyone who mattered was there. Mrs. Dane Calthrop, the vicar's wife, presided over the teapot with serene vagueness. Miss Marple sat in the corner by the window, knitting something small and pale blue at astonishing speed. Around the table sat the chief suspects, summoned, Mrs. Bantry later explained, because one simply must carry on, and besides, it's the best way to observe them all at once. Tommy Pierce slouched in his chair, hands thrust deep in his pockets, eyes fixed on the carpet. Mrs. Lavinia Croft sat ramrod straight, lips thin, her black handbag clutched like a shield. Clarissa Vale, pretty in a flowered cotton dress, laughed rather too brightly at nothing in particular, and helped herself to a second slice of apple charlotte. Reginald Archer, the land agent, consulted his gold pocket watch every few minutes as though time itself were a personal enemy. Inspector Craddock had been invited purely in an unofficial capacity, and stood quietly by the mantelpiece accepting a cup of tea but refusing cake. Conversation began inevitably with the weather and the likelihood of rain spoiling Saturday's crowning of the Dairy Queen. It moved, just as inevitably, to the tragedy at Gossington Farm. "Such a shock," said Mrs. Dane Calthrop vaguely. "Poor Mr. Bannings. Though I always felt he might come to a sudden end. One of those vigorous old men, you know." "Accident, of course," said Mrs. Croft firmly. He was always clumsy with tools. I warned him about that pitchfork 100 times. Tommy Pierce muttered something inaudible. Clarissa Vale tossed her curls. Well, I can't see that it matters much now. The farm will go to Tommy, I suppose, and life goes on. Tommy flushed dark red but said nothing. Mr. Archer cleared his throat. A very regrettable business. Naturally, my principals will withdraw their offer to purchase, for the moment at least. Out of respect. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. She appeared to be listening only with half an ear, yet nothing escaped her. Mrs. Dane Calthrop turned to the inspector. "And what does Scotland Yard make of it all, Inspector? We are all longing to know." Craddock smiled politely. "We are keeping an open mind, madam, but certain routine inquiries must be made. Alibis, for instance." A small silence fell. "Alibis?" repeated Mrs. Croft sharply. "For an accident?" "Purely routine," Craddock assured her. "Now the doctor places the time of death between 4:30 and 6 yesterday morning. Perhaps we might just establish where everyone was." He began, deceptively casual, with Tommy. "You found the body, I believe, Mr. Pierce?" Tommy shifted uncomfortably. "I cycled past about 6:15 on my way to the garage. Saw the door open, went in. That's all." "And before that?" "In bed. Ask my landlady, Mrs. Bird at the Blue Boar. I came in at 11:30 the night before and didn't stir till 6. Mrs. Croft was next. "I rise at 6, she said crisply. "I was in the kitchen preparing Mr. Banning's breakfast tray when he didn't come down at his usual time. I assumed he'd gone straight to the parlor, as he sometimes did." "You didn't see him alive that morning?" "I did not." Clarissa Vale laughed lightly. "Well, I was fast asleep in my little flat above the surgery. Dr. Haydock will vouch for me. He rang at 7 to say he needed me early because of the excitement." Mr. Archer laid down his teaspoon with precision. "I caught the 8:15 from Paddington the previous evening. Arrived home in Much Benham just after 10. My housekeeper will confirm. I was at my desk by 8:30 yesterday morning." Miss Marple laid her knitting in her lap and spoke for the first time, her voice gentle. "How curious," she said mildly. "The station master at Much Benham is a great friend of my nephew's. Such a nice man. He happened to mention only yesterday that a gentleman in a camel hair coat, very distinctive, bought a ticket for the 8:15 but missed the train and took the milk train instead. The milk train, I believe, arrives at 6:15. Mr. Archer's teacup rattled sharply in its saucer. "A case of mistaken identity, no doubt," he said smoothly. "Many men wear camel hair coats." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, picking up her needles again. The conversation turned determinedly to bunting and prize categories, but a constraint had settled over the room. Clarissa helped herself to a third slice of apple charlotte and ate it too quickly. Tommy stared out of the window. Mrs. Croft's lips were pressed into a line so thin they almost disappeared. Inspector Craddock caught Miss Marple's eye and gave her the faintest nod of acknowledgement. When tea was over and the company began to disperse, Miss Marple lingered to help Mrs. Dane Calthrop gather cups. "You were very quiet, Miss Marple," said the vicar's wife, "but I always think you see more than most of us." "One tries to observe," Miss Marple replied modestly, "though sometimes what one observes is rather puzzling. That buttercup in the churn lid, for instance, pressed so flat, almost as though someone wished to leave a signature." Mrs. Dane Calthrop looked vague. "Buttercup? Signature? My dear Miss Marple, you do say the oddest things." Miss Marple smiled gently and did not explain. Outside in the vicarage garden, the rain that had threatened all day began to fall in earnest, pattering on the leaves of the laurel bushes. Miss Marple opened her umbrella and set off down the lane towards home. She was thinking about alibis, how easy they were to give and how difficult sometimes to prove. She was thinking about the station master's casual remark, and about the way Mr. Archer's hand had trembled just a little when he replaced his cup. And most of all, she was thinking about Rosie Trotter still missing, and about what the girl might have seen or heard that had frightened her into hiding. As she passed the lich gate, the church clock struck 5. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked and the rain whispered on the gravestones. Miss Marple walked on, her mind busy with small, seemingly unimportant details that were slowly, carefully, beginning to form a pattern. Chapter 6. The Girl in the Blue Dress. The rain that had threatened all day settled into a steady downpour by late afternoon, drumming on rooftops and turning the lanes of St. Mary Mead into shallow streams. Umbrellas bloomed like dark mushrooms as villagers hurried home, and the church clock struck the hour with a muffled, melancholy note. Miss Marple sat by her drawing-room fire, a light wool shawl about her shoulders, knitting needles moving with their usual quiet precision. She had just finished a row when the telephone rang in the hall, sharp and insistent. It was Inspector Craddock. "We've found her, Miss Marple, Rosie Trotter, hiding in the old gamekeeper's hut on Sir Henry Clithering's estate. Poor child's half frozen and terrified out of her wits. I'm bringing her to Gossington Hall. Mrs. Bantry has offered a quiet room. I thought you might like to be there when we speak to her." Miss Marple laid down her knitting. "I shall come at once, Inspector. A familiar face may help." Half an hour later, she was seated in Mrs. Bantry's small morning room, a coal fire crackling cheerfully in the grate. Inspector Craddock stood by the window, hands behind his back. Mrs. Bantry fussed with cushions and hot water bottles, and Dr. Haydock waited quietly in the corner, his medical bag open on a side table. The door opened and Rosie Trotter was brought in, barefoot, shivering, wrapped in a constable's overcoat 2 sizes too large. Her brown hair hung limp and wet, and her face was streaked with tears and grime. Beneath the coat could be glimpsed the blood-stained milkmaid's apron she still wore, now crumpled and torn. Mrs. Bantry gave a little cry of sympathy and hurried forward with a blanket. "There, there, my dear, sit by the fire, you're safe now." Rosie collapsed into the offered chair, clutching the blanket around her like a shield. Her eyes, wide and frightened, darted from face to face until they rested on Miss Marple. "Miss Marple," she whispered. "I never meant no harm. I swear I never." Miss Marple leaned forward and took the girl's cold hands in her own. "Of course you didn't, child. No one here thinks that. But you must tell us what happened. Why did you run away?" Rosie swallowed hard, tears spilling over. "I went to the parlour early, about 10 to 5. The cows were restless, and I thought I'd start the milking before Mr. Bannings came down. The side door was open a crack. I went in, and there he was, slumped against the wall with the pitchfork." Her voice broke. "There was blood everywhere. I screamed, I know I did, and then I ran. I didn't know what else to do." Inspector Craddock spoke gently. "You saw no one else? Heard nothing?" Rosie shook her head. "Nothing. Only the cows lowing, and the big churn was gone from its place. I noticed that straight away. Mr. Bannings was particular about the festival churn. He polished it himself every week." Dr. Haydock offered a glass of hot milk laced with something restorative. Rosie sipped it gratefully, color slowly returning to her cheeks. "But why hide, Rosie?" asked Mrs. Bantry. "Why not come straight to someone, your mother or Constable Polk?" Rosie's hands trembled on the glass. "Because of what I know, what I've seen these past months. If whoever did it found out, they'd come after me too." Craddock leaned forward. "What have you seen, Rosie? You must tell us." The girl glanced nervously at the door, then lowered her voice. "The letters. Mr. Bannings was getting letters. Anonymous ones. They came in the post, no address, just pushed through the farm door sometimes. I found one once when I was cleaning. He'd dropped it by his chair. It had a pressed buttercup inside and words cut out from newspapers. You know what you did. Pay or everyone will know. He was that upset, went white as milk, burned it in the stove straight away. Miss Marple's eyes were very bright. Buttercups, again, she murmured. How significant. And were there many of these letters? Rosie nodded. 4 or 5 at least. The last one came the day before it happened. I saw it on the desk when I took in his afternoon tea. Same buttercup pressed inside. He snatched it away quick, but I saw his hands shaking. That night he told me not to come early next morning. Said he had private business at 4:30 and didn't want me about. But I forgot. He'd been so sharp with me lately, my mind was all upset, and I went early anyway. Craddock made a note. This is important, Rosie. Did you ever see who delivered the letters? Or recognize anything about them? Rosie hesitated. The paper was ordinary, same as the church notices are typed on. And once I thought I saw Mrs. Croft coming out of the estate office late, when she had no business there. But I might have been mistaken. Mrs. Bantry gave a little gasp. Mrs. Croft, Rosie shrank back. I shouldn't have said. Please don't tell her I told. She's always been kind in her way, but lately she's been that sharp. Ever since the new will? Miss Marple offered the girl a peppermint from her handbag. A small, comforting ritual. Tell us about the buttercups, my dear, she said softly. You wore them at the festival last year. Did Mr. Bannings ever speak of them? Rosie managed a watery smile. He said they suited me. Said I looked like a proper milkmaid out of a picture book. But then after the letters started, he told me not to pick them anymore. Said they brought bad luck. I thought it odd. He'd never been superstitious. Dr. Haydock closed his bag. She needs rest and proper food. Shock does funny things. I'll give her something to help her sleep. Rosie clutched Miss Marple's hand suddenly. Don't let them send me home yet. Not till it's safe, please. Miss Marple patted her hand reassuringly. You shall stay here tonight, child. Mrs. Bantry will look after you and no one will trouble you. As the girl was led away to a warm bedroom, Craddock turned to Miss Marple. Blackmail, he said quietly. That changes everything. Someone in the village knew a secret bad enough to frighten Elias Bannings into paying. And when he stopped, they killed him. Miss Marple gazed into the fire. Yes, and they used buttercups as their signature. Someone who knew Rosie wore them proudly. Someone who wished to mock or to point suspicion towards an innocent girl. It is all very cleverly hateful. Outside, the rain had eased to a gentle patter. The fire settled with a small shower of sparks. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, but her thoughts were far from pale blue booties. They were occupied with pressed flowers, anonymous letters, and a murderer who had chosen a most unpleasant way to sign their work. Chapter 7. The Language of Flowers. The rain had cleared overnight, leaving the air washed clean and the village garden sparkling under a pale autumn sun. Gossington Hall basked in the mild light, its windows thrown open to let in the scent of damp earth and late roses. In the breakfast room, Inspector Craddock spread his papers across the mahogany table while Mrs. Bantry fussed with coffee and toast. Rosie Trotter, pale but composed after a good night's sleep, sat wrapped in one of Mrs. Bantry's dressing gowns, her hands clasped around a cup of tea. Miss Marple, invited early, occupied her usual chair by the fireplace, a light shawl about her shoulders and her knitting untouched in her lap. Craddock laid out the anonymous letters, or rather the fragments that remained. Only one had survived, the last, found crumpled in the waste paper basket and rescued before the housemaid emptied it. The message was composed of words cut from newspapers and pasted on cheap notepaper. You have had long enough. Pay or the village will know what you are. Enclosed was a single pressed buttercup, now dry and brittle, its golden petals faded to parchment. Blackmail, plain as day, said Craddock, and the buttercup as a signature. Rosie says there were at least 4 previous letters, all with the same flower. Mrs. Bantry peered over his shoulder. Buttercups! Whoever heard of such a thing? Roses for love, violets for faithfulness, but buttercups, Miss Marple spoke gently. There is an old language of flowers, Dolly, though it is not much regarded nowadays. Buttercups signify ingratitude, or sometimes you are rich in attractions but poor in heart. A cruel choice for a man who prided himself on his respectability. Rosie nodded. That's what upset him so. He kept saying no one must know whatever it was. Burned the letters himself, but I saw the flowers. Always buttercups pressed flat. Craddock turned to her. Did he ever speak of the secret itself? Give any hint? Rosie shook her head. Never. Only that it was something from long ago before he married Mrs. Bannings. He said some mistakes couldn't be undone and money would keep them buried. Miss Marple's eyes rested thoughtfully on the pressed flower. Money, she repeated. How much was paid, I wonder? And to whom? Craddock produced a bank ledger, seized from the farm office. 5 withdrawals of £50 each over the past 6 months. Large sums for a man as careful as Bannings. Always in cash. The last was a fortnight ago. Mrs. Bantry gave a low whistle. £250. That's a fortune. No wonder he stopped paying. And no wonder, said Miss Marple quietly. Someone decided to silence him forever. Craddock gathered the letters. We've taken samples of typewriting from every machine in the village, the vicarage, the estate office, the Women's Institute, even the school. The imperial in the estate office has a faulty E, sticks slightly. It matches the one surviving envelope. Rosie looked startled. That's the machine Mrs. Croft uses for the church accounts. She goes in every Thursday evening. Craddock made a note. So she has access, but so do half a dozen others. Miss Marple leaned forward. Tell me, Rosie, did Mr. Bannings ever speak of changing his will? Rosie hesitated. Only once. About 2 months ago after one of the letters came. He was that upset. Said he'd been a fool to trust certain people and he'd see Tommy right after all. Tommy was his only bloodkin, he said, and blood should come first. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. So the new will in favor of Tommy was made after the blackmail began. Interesting. Craddock closed his notebook. We've located both wills. The old one, 5 years old, leaves the farm and everything to Mrs. Croft in grateful recognition of her faithful service. The new one, signed 6 weeks ago, leaves everything to Tommy Pierce with a curious condition. That he marry within a year of inheriting. Rosie flushed pink. Tommy and we've been walking out quiet-like. No one knew except Mother. Mr. Bannings must have guessed. Miss Marple's gaze was very kindly. And did Tommy know about the condition? I don't think so. He was furious with his great-uncle. Thought he'd been cut out altogether. That row the village heard was about money for a motorbike, but underneath it was fear he'd get nothing. Craddock stood up. We'll need to speak to Mrs. Croft again, and to Tommy. The motive is becoming clearer. Someone stood to lose a great deal if the blackmail failed and the will was changed. As Rosie was taken upstairs to rest, Miss Marple lingered with the inspector in the hall. There is cruelty here, she said softly. The choice of buttercups was meant to hurt, not just to identify. Someone who knew Rosie wore them proudly at the festival, who perhaps resented her innocence or her place in the household. Craddock nodded. Jealousy as well as greed. Mrs. Croft has been with the family 30 years, faithful service but no blood tie. To be displaced by a sulky boy like Tommy must have rankled. Or, said Miss Marple, someone else entirely using Mrs. Croft's access to the typewriter to cast suspicion elsewhere. She paused at the front door, looking out over the dripping garden. Buttercups bruise so easily, Inspector. Press them and the mark remains forever. I think our blackmailer has left more marks than they intended. Craddock smiled faintly. You have a theory already, Miss Marple? Not a theory, she corrected gently. Merely a pattern beginning to emerge. One must be patient with patterns. They reveal themselves in time. She stepped out into the mild sunshine, her umbrella furled, and walked slowly down the drive. In the hedge, a few late buttercups still nodded, bright and innocent, against the dark leaves. Miss Marple regarded them thoughtfully. Poor things, she murmured. So pretty in the meadow, so sinister when pressed between hostile fingers. Back at the hall, Craddock telephoned for a car. The net was drawing tighter, and somewhere in St. Mary Mead a murderer was beginning to feel its threads. The village itself went about its quiet business. The butcher's boy delivered joints for Sunday dinner, the vicar's wife arranged flowers in the church, and old Colonel Bantry pottered in his greenhouse, quite oblivious to the drama unfolding under his roof. Yet beneath the calm surface, tension grew. Mrs. Croft was seen hurrying to the post office with a tight-lipped expression. Tommy Pierce was observed kicking moodily at stones in the lane, and Clarissa Vale, pretty and careless, bought a new hat in much Benham and laughed too loudly when asked about the tragedy. Miss Marple, returning home, paused at her gate to speak to the gardener's boy. "Leonard," she said, "do you ever pick buttercups for your sweetheart?" The boy blushed crimson. "Sometimes, miss, though mother says they're weeds." Miss Marple smiled. "Weeds to some, treasures to others. It quite depends on the heart that receives them." She went indoors to her luncheon, her mind busy with the language of flowers and the even more complicated language of human hearts. Chapter 8. The second will Sunday morning dawned bright and crisp, with a touch of frost silvering the village green, and the church bells calling the faithful to matins. St. Mary Mead presented its most respectable face. Cottage curtains twitched as parishioners in their Sunday best made their way along the lanes, nodding politely while minds buzzed with the one topic no sermon could displace. At Gossington Hall, Inspector Craddock had arranged what he called a quiet word with the principal parties. The drawing room, with its comfortable chintz sofas and bowls of late chrysanthemums, had been chosen for the occasion. A coal fire burned brightly, and rain from the night before still tapped occasionally against the tall French windows. Mrs. Bantry, acting as hostess, had provided coffee and a plate of her cook's excellent shortbread. Miss Marple sat quietly in her accustomed corner, a half-finished booty in her lap, her eyes missing nothing. One by one they arrived. Tommy Pierce came first, shuffling and sullen in his one good suit, collar too tight. Mrs. Croft followed, upright and severe in black bombazine, her lips pressed into a line of disapproval. Clarissa Vale appeared in a smart green coat with a fur collar, cheeks pink from the cold air and perhaps something more. Reginald Archer was last, impeccably turned out, a slight frown between his brows as though the whole affair were an inconvenience to his timetable. Craddock waited until they were all seated, then placed 2 documents on the occasional table before him. "These are the wills of the late Mr. Elias Bannings," he began evenly. "The first, dated 5 years ago, leaves the entire estate, farm, land, money, to Mrs. Lavinia Croft in recognition of her long and faithful service." Mrs. Croft inclined her head stiffly, but her hands tightened on her handbag. "The second will, made 6 weeks ago and properly witnessed by Dr. Haydock and the vicar, revokes the first. It leaves everything to Mr. Thomas Pierce with one condition, that he marry within 12 months of inheriting. Tommy's head jerked up, eyes wide. Marry? I never knew. He never said a word about that. Clarissa Vale gave a small, nervous laugh that broke in the middle. Really, Tommy, how very medieval. Though I suppose it explains why he was always asking when we meant to set the date. Tommy flushed scarlet. We hadn't told anyone, it was private. Mrs. Croft rose half out of her chair, voice sharp. If this is true, it's a disgrace. 30 years I gave that man, 30 years of loyalty, and he throws me over for a sulky boy who never did a proper day's work in his life. Craddock raised a hand. Please, Mrs. Croft, sit down. No one is accusing you yet, but you must see that motives abound. Mr. Bannings was being blackmailed. We know that. Someone in this village knew a secret from his past and was bleeding him for money. When the payments stopped, he changed his will, and shortly afterwards he was murdered. Reginald Archer leaned forward, smooth as ever. Surely, Inspector, you are not suggesting any of us would stoop to murder over a will? As for myself, I had a perfectly good offer for the farm, but Mr. Bannings refused it. His death changes nothing. My principals will simply wait for the estate to be settled. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Yet you were seen at Much Benham Station very early on the morning of the murder, Mr. Archer. The milk train arrives at 6:15. Time enough, perhaps, for a man who knows the lanes well to reach Gossington Farm by 5:30. Archer's smile did not waver. A case of mistaken identity, as I said before. I was at home. Clarissa Vale tossed her curls. Well, I certainly didn't kill him. He was an old fool flirting with me one minute and dropping me the next. But murder? I wouldn't know how to begin, Tommy muttered. I didn't even know about the marriage condition. I thought he'd cut me out altogether. That row everyone heard, I was angry because he wouldn't advance me £50. I needed it for something important. Miss Marple regarded him mildly. For an engagement ring, perhaps. Tommy's flush deepened, but he said nothing. Mrs. Croft's voice cut across the room like a knife. If anyone had cause, it was me. 30 years, and then to be cast aside for a boy who quarreled with him daily. But I didn't kill him. I was in my kitchen at 6, as I told you, and I certainly didn't write poisonous letters with buttercups. Craddock opened a folder and laid out photographs. The pressed buttercup from the churn lid, the one from the surviving letter. These flowers were chosen deliberately, someone who knew their meaning, or who knew that Rosie Trotter wore them with pride at last year's festival. Someone who wished to torment Mr. Bannings and perhaps cast suspicion on an innocent girl. Clarissa laughed again, too brightly. Really, Inspector, buttercups, how melodramatic. Miss Marple laid her knitting aside. Melodrama is often the refuge of the guilty, Miss Vale. A simple crime dressed up with flowers and anonymous letters to make it seem more complicated than it is. Clarissa's laugh faltered. Craddock gathered the wills. We are checking handwriting, typewriters, footprints, alibis, and we are particularly interested in left-handed people. Someone pressed that buttercup in the churn lid with their left hand. The angle is unmistakable. Mrs. Croft's right hand tightened on her bag, but her left, usually hidden in the folds of her skirt, remained still. Clarissa Vale rose abruptly. This is ridiculous. I've a headache. I'm going home. She swept out, leaving a faint scent of expensive perfume. Tommy followed soon after, muttering about the garage. Archer lingered only to assure Craddock once more of his complete innocence. When only Mrs. Croft remained, she stood very straight. I love that farm, she said quietly. Not for the money, but for the years I gave it. If he changed his will because of those wicked letters, then the shame is on him, not me. She left with dignity, closing the door softly behind her. Mrs. Bantry let out a long breath. Well, if that wasn't uncomfortable, I don't know what is. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again. Uncomfortable truths often are, Dolly. But we are getting closer. Notice how Miss Vale dropped her handbag when the marriage condition was mentioned? 3 lipsticks rolled out, all the new coral pink shade. One of them left a tiny smudge on the surviving letter, the one found in the waste paper basket. Careless. Craddock's eyes sharpened. You saw that? I observe small things, Miss Marple said modestly, and small things so often matter. Outside, the church bells ceased, and the congregation began to emerge into the pale sunlight. St. Mary Mead settled back into its Sunday calm, but in the drawing room at Gossington Hall the pattern was tightening. One more piece, Miss Marple thought, and the picture would be complete. She finished her row of knitting and began another, the needles clicking softly like the quiet ticking of a clock counting down to revelation. Chapter 9. The Truth in the Dairy. The revelation took place not in the grandeur of Gossington Hall's drawing room, but in the low-beamed whitewashed dairy at Gossington Farm itself, a setting Mrs. Bantry declared far more suitable for a proper unmasking. The dairy smelled comfortingly of cool stone and fresh milk, and the afternoon light slanted through small windows onto the scrubbed tables and rows of gleaming pans. Everyone concerned had been summoned by polite but firm notes from Inspector Craddock. They assembled rather awkwardly among the churns and butter pats. Tommy Pierce looking bewildered, Mrs. Croft rigid with disapproval. Clarissa Vale in an elegant tweed suit that seemed out of place among the dairy utensils, and Reginald Archer consulting his watch as though timing an appointment. Rosie Trotter, pale but steady, stood near the door with her mother's arm about her. Dr. Haydock and Sir Henry Clithering were present as witnesses, and Colonel Bantry hovered in the background, frankly curious. Miss Marple sat on a low stool near the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap, a picture of elderly innocence. Rain pattered gently against the panes, and the only sound at first was the occasional drip from a tap. Inspector Craddock cleared his throat. Thank you all for coming. Certain facts have now come to light, and it seems best to clear the air once and for all. He placed the festival churn, the tall, brass-bound one that had been submerged in the duck pond, prominently on a central table. Its lid lay beside it, the pressed buttercup still faintly visible on the inner surface. Miss Marple spoke first, her voice soft but carrying clearly in the quiet room. It was all perfectly simple, she began. Once one understood the significance of the buttercup and the churn. Mr. Bannings was being blackmailed by someone who knew a shameful secret from his youth. A youthful folly, nothing truly dreadful, but enough to wound his pride. The blackmailer signed their letters with pressed buttercups, a cruel choice, meaning ingratitude or sarcasm. On the night before the murder, the blackmailer arranged a final meeting in the milking parlour at 4:30, early enough that no one would disturb them. They quarreled. In a moment of fury, the blackmailer seized the pitchfork and struck Mr. Bannings down. Then came the difficulty. The door was bolted from the inside, the body impossible to move quickly without help. But our murderer was resourceful. They remembered the festival churn, tall enough to conceal a folded body. They placed Mr. Bannings inside, wheeled it out through the side door, for which they had a key, and hid it temporarily in the barn. Later, they intended to sink it permanently in the pond. But Rosie arrived earlier than expected. In panic, the murderer pressed a final buttercup against the inside of the lid, their signature, and fled, discarding Rosie's blood-stained apron to cast suspicion on the girl. A small silence followed. Clarissa Vale gave a nervous laugh. Really, Miss Marple, this is like something out of a sensation novel. Miss Marple regarded her mildly. Truth is often stranger than fiction, Miss Vale, and far more careless. You were the blackmailer. You learned Mr. Banning's secret while nursing his late wife. She confided in you during her final illness. You saw an opportunity, money and perhaps marriage to Tommy, which would secure the farm through him once the marriage condition in the new will was fulfilled. You typed the letters on the estate office imperial, the faulty E matches. You pressed the buttercups with your left hand. You are left-handed, though you take pains to conceal it, writing and eating with your right in public. The angle of the flower in the churn lid proves it. And finally, the lipstick, coral pink, the new shade. A tiny smudge on the surviving letter and another on the envelope found in the waste paper basket. You dropped your handbag at the vicarage tea. 3 identical lipsticks rolled out. One had been used to seal the envelope with a careless kiss. Clarissa's face had gone very white. This is absurd. You can't prove... But we can, said Craddock quietly. He produced a small evidence bag containing a lipstick. This was found in the nettles near the discarded apron, dropped in your haste. The shade matches exactly. And your alibi, sleeping above the surgery. Dr. Haydock has now recalled that you were out early that morning, returning just before his telephone call. Clarissa looked wildly about her. Tommy stared as though seeing her for the first time. You, he whispered. But why? Because I was tired of being poor, she flashed. Tired of pretending to like an old man for presents. And then he ended it. Said he'd been a fool. When I learned about his secret from his wife, it seemed the perfect way. He paid at first. Then he stopped and changed his will to force your hand with marriage. I thought if we married quickly. She broke off, realizing too late how much she had admitted. Mrs. Croft gave a small, bitter laugh. So it was you all along, not me. Clarissa made a sudden dart for the door, but Sir Henry Clithering was there before her, his old soldier's grip firm on her arm. I'm afraid not, my dear, he said gently. Craddock stepped forward with the handcuffs. Clarissa Vale, I arrest you for the murder of Elias Bannings. The rest was formalities. Clarissa was led away, no longer laughing. Tommy stood as though turned to stone. Rosie began to cry quietly against her mother's shoulder. Miss Marple rose from her stool. The real tragedy, she said softly, is that Mr. Bannings's secret was so slight, a young man's vanity long ago. But pride is a terrible thing. It made him pay, and it made Miss Vale kill. Outside, the rain had stopped. A watery sun broke through the clouds, gilding the wet flags of the dairy yard. Mrs. Bantry bustled forward with offers of tea, but no one felt like tea just yet. Miss Marple walked slowly back towards the village, her umbrella furled. The pattern was complete at last, a bright poisonous thread drawn out and snipped. In the meadows, the last buttercups of the year bowed their golden heads, innocent of the harm done in their name. Chapter 10. Tea and Reconciliation. A week later, the village of St. Mary Mead had settled back into its accustomed rhythm. The dairy festival had been postponed out of respect, but life, as Miss Marple often observed, must go on. The frost had melted into mild December-like weather, though it was still only September, and the meadows lay quiet under a pale sun. In Miss Marple's small drawing room, the fire burned brightly, and the tea table was laid with her best spode china. Thin bread and butter, scones with strawberry jam and clotted cream, a seed cake, and a dish of her own quince jelly glowing like captured sunshine. Her guests were carefully chosen. Rosie Trotter sat beside Tommy Pierce, her hand resting shyly in his. Mrs. Trotter beamed from the sofa, a new hat perched proudly on her head. Mrs. Bantry occupied the largest armchair, helping herself liberally to scones. Inspector Craddock stood by the mantelpiece, a cup of tea balanced in one hand. while Sir Henry Clithering leaned against the window frame, pipe sending gentle puffs of smoke towards the ceiling. Miss Marple poured tea with her usual precision. "1 lump or 2, Inspector. And do try the seed cake. It turned out rather well this year." Craddock accepted a generous slice. "You were quite right, Miss Marple. Clarissa Vale has confessed everything. The secret was trivial, as you said. A youthful engagement broken off rather heartlessly, and a child given up for adoption. Nothing criminal, but enough to wound a proud man's vanity if it came out." Mrs. Bantry nodded vigorously. "Pride. That's what it always comes down to. Poor Mr. Bannings, paying all that money to keep a little foolishness buried." Rosie looked up, her cheeks pink. "She wanted me blamed, miss. Those buttercups. I loved them so, it hurts to think of them used that way." Miss Marple handed her a scone. "My dear, flowers are innocent. It is people who twist them. You must wear buttercups again next festival. They will mean sunshine once more." Tommy cleared his throat awkwardly. "The farm's mine now, free and clear. The marriage condition doesn't matter anymore, but Rosie and I, we've decided to be married anyway, quiet-like, in the spring. And Mother Trotter will have the cottage by the duck pond just as she wanted." Mrs. Trotter dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "After all these years, my Rosie a farmer's wife. Who'd have thought it?" Sir Henry Clithering tapped out his pipe. "A very satisfactory outcome. Though I confess, Jane, I was quite at sea until the end. That business with the lipstick. Pure genius." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Not genius, Sir Henry. Merely observation. Young women are often careless with cosmetics, and coral pink is such a distinctive shade. Combined with the left-handed pressing of the flower and the typewriter E, well, the pattern became clear. Craddock set down his cup. The churn was the cleverest part. Without your insight about concealing the body temporarily, we might never have understood how the bolted door fitted in." Miss Marple shook her head. "Village life teaches one so much about practical matters. I once knew a carpenter who moved an entire wardrobe down narrow stairs by turning it on its side. The principle is the same." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. "And the buttercups! Whoever would have thought of using the language of flowers for blackmail? It's quite wickedly ingenious." "Wicked, certainly," agreed Miss Marple, "but not ingenious. Cruelty so often masquerades as cleverness. Poor Miss Vale. She wanted security and excitement and thought money would buy both. But happiness comes from simpler things." She passed the quince jelly to Rosie. "Try this, my dear. It is made from fruit grown on a south wall, rather like life. The best flavors often come after a little hardship." Rosie smiled shyly. "Tommy says we'll keep jerseys, Miss Marple, and plant a new rose garden by the farmhouse door." Tommy nodded, less sullen than usual. "And no more quarreling. Great-uncle was hard, but perhaps he meant well in his way. With the marriage condition and all." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Old men grow lonely, Tommy. Sometimes they express affection oddly. But you and Rosie will make the farm happy again, I feel sure." Outside, the church clock struck 4, its notes floating across the quiet village. A blackbird sang from the apple tree, and somewhere in the distance the lowing of cows carried on the still air. Mrs. Bantry finished her third scone and sighed contentedly. "Well, Jane, another mystery solved. Whatever should we do without you?" Miss Marple refilled the teapot from the silver kettle. "My dear Dolly, I do nothing. I merely sit and knit and notice what everyone else notices. But perhaps I notice a little more completely." Sir Henry raised his cup in a small toast. "To Miss Marple, the gentlest and sharpest detective in England." Miss Marple blushed faintly. "Really, Sir Henry? Some more tea?" The little party continued in comfortable conversation. plans for the wedding, the price of milk, the vicar's new sermon series. Outside, St. Mary Mead dozed peacefully in the afternoon sun, its secrets for the moment laid to rest. When her guests had gone, Miss Marple cleared the tea things with the help of her maid, then settled back by the fire with her knitting. The pale blue booty was nearly finished, destined perhaps for a christening in the spring. She looked out at the garden where the last leaves drifted gently from the trees. Human nature, she murmured to herself, is very much the same everywhere. Greed, pride, fear, and sometimes, thank heaven, love that rights the balance. The fire settled with a soft sigh. Another small thread of evil had been snipped, another pattern made clear by the quiet click of knitting needles and the gentle observation of an old lady who understood the world very well indeed. In the meadow beyond the village, a few late buttercups still lingered, golden and bright against the green. They would fade with the first frost, but come spring they would bloom again, innocent, cheerful, and quite untouched by the darkness that had briefly borrowed their name.